Hi, so I am Jean Gannell. I was going to be a panelist, but our moderator had a scheduling conflict, so I'm going to go ahead and moderate today's session. I will go ahead and let our wonderful panelists kind of introduce themselves, starting with Luke.
Hi, my name is Luke Fisher, and I'm the managing director at Veritas Forensic Accounting and Economics. My focus is really exclusively on cases involving investigative accounting, financial analysis, fraud examination, and really economic research and economic damages in general. I've worked really all across North America and in Europe as well.
Eli?
Hello, Eli Neal, owner, founder of Four Corners Financial Forensics based in Bellevue, Washington. We do business valuation, forensic accounting, economic damages calculation. Often I serve as expert witness in litigation and disputes.
Okay, Jim.
And I'm Jim Casimir. I'm a director in the Valuation Advisory Services group of Cohn Resnick LLP. Cohn Resnick is a national advisory, accounting, and tax firm that services the cannabis industry as well as all other industries. And in my practice, I'm primarily involved in valuing privately owned businesses and have been involved in the valuation of cannabis businesses for about the last 8 years.
All right, and just really quickly about me, I'm a cannabis industry attorney starting in 2012 in Colorado. And part of that, obviously, a lot of regulatory law, administrative law, litigation, and business transactions, but all solely based in the marijuana industry specifically due to the heavy regulations. So let's go ahead and really quickly do want to thank our sponsors. We have Mood, a hardworking cannabis, as well as a couple of additional sponsors that we just want to make sure everybody takes a look at and read their great summaries that they've provided to us. So let's go ahead and kind of kick it off with banking. Sorry, not banking. Business issues that come up in the marijuana world. Let's go ahead and start with Luke. What type of issues come up in marijuana businesses in this area from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think it's important to think about, just regardless of the industry, but talking about the marijuana industry, business continuity. What does that even mean? Really, just that means how do you respond? How are you able to either maintain or quickly resume operations after a disruption, whether it be minor to catastrophic? And so, for example, if you have a facility that burns to the ground, what do? Do you have to wait for that building to be completely rebuilt, get permits, go through the whole process to get a structure back on the ground where you can resume operation? Or do you already have a plan in place, excuse me, to be able to go to a temporary location, be able to outfit that location and hit the ground running and reduce that impact period? So really thinking about, okay, business continuity, that's risk management. How do you manage the risks that you're dealing with within your industry, and say a catastrophic event were to take place? What do? You want to be proactive versus reactive. So this is on the front end before anything happens, asking yourself, okay, if an event takes place, if I lose a crop, what do I have to do? What are my suppliers? What's my grow time? What are the different options that I'm going to have at my disposal to resume operation? And it's very beneficial to have done that ahead of time, have it documented, have a plan. So when you're in crisis mode, you don't have to really just come up with a plan off the top of your head. You can refer to the plan that you've laid out and execute it. That's really the heart of business continuity and the intent of really just, it's a safeguard for you.
Yeah. And that actually brings up really good points that, with this portion of the slides, how do you calculate for those types of financial losses after the events? So obviously, if you're planning ahead, what happens after that portion of the process?
Yeah, so in most interruptions or most events where there is interruption, you're not going to be able to mitigate or reduce or plan around to where there's absolutely no loss. So you have a loss. What do you do to calculate the financial loss? In a nutshell, you ask yourself one question: what would have happened had the event not occurred to my P&L, to my profit and loss statement? Okay, so what does that mean? Well, you're going to look at every line on your profit and loss statement, starting with revenue. Okay, what would have happened to my revenue? Would it have been going up? Would it have remained the same? Or would it have gone down? Now, depending on trends, depending on if are you in a growth phase, are you stable business, just looking at, okay, you have monthly P&Ls, you have monthly revenue, you know what you're doing. Well, I have an interruption and my revenue craters. Okay, well, that's a pretty easy thing to see, to carve out that dip and say, okay, well, this is my revenue loss. Now, that's not the be all end all. That's gross revenue, but that's not the income loss. You have to then consider expenses as well. And one of the terms that you'll hear is, okay, revenue, lost revenue, less non-continuing expenses or avoided expenses. So for example, if you lose revenue, perhaps you didn't end up actually selling the product because there was some property damage, you had to close maybe a storefront or something of that nature for a short period of time. Well, you still have the product that you're going to be able to sell again down the road. So you haven't lost that cost of goods sold. You haven't incurred that cost. So it'd be loss of revenue less any of the expenses that have gone away. Generally, it would be your cost of goods sold, could be some labor, things of that nature that are going to go away. But just look at each line and go, would this have remained the same, gone up, or gone down for each line within the P&L?
So what is the standard for calculating damages, specifically to marijuana businesses?
Yeah, so when working with individuals that have had a loss situation, a lot of times there's frustration, or maybe some hand wringing is a better phrase for it, of how do I prove up my damages? How do I show that this is what I've lost? And what I tell people is, okay, you're thinking of this from a bar of perfection. That's not the standard for damages. The standard is reasonable certainty, more likely than not. So in litigation cases, what we as experts, we will refer to FRE 702, Federal Rules of Evidence, Rule 702 for us. And that essentially, it lays out our framework, and it's for us to provide relevant, reliable findings to assist the trier of fact on a more likely than not basis. So our charge is to not, we don't have to be perfect, but what's more likely than not? What's reasonable? Is there a reasonable basis for the damage figure and for the really the story you're trying to tell? You know, that's something that I think, regardless of industry, if you have a loss, you're not just trying to put numbers together, you're trying to tell a story to support the numbers that you're submitting, trying to be made whole. So have that in the back of your mind whenever you are going. Hopefully you never have to deal with a loss situation, but if you are, think about what's the story I'm trying to tell, and how do I convey that in the most reasonable manner to show, wow, this is very reasonable. This is more likely than not.
So as to loss mitigation, and the issues that obviously come into that area, how does this typically occur in instances where there is a business interruption? You know, if there's a fire at a grow, you have to shut down the facility, that type of situation.
Yeah. So, for example, if you have a fire at a grower's facility, okay, loss mitigation. What can you do? Is there? I mean, can you buy from a third party? You know, if you have a relationship or a client that I have to deliver a certain amount of product in a very specific amount of time, and there's no way I can do that now. Okay, I'm going to lose the relationship. I'm going to lose the income from that sale. Is there a third party that you have to fill the gap? Can you go out and find produce to actually be able to deliver on the on that order, maintain the relationship? It's going to cost you more, but you have reduce the damages that you otherwise would have sustained. Loss mitigation. Essentially, that is, how do I reduce or minimize the harm of an adverse event on my business? So another thing you could be doing is, well, we're going to offer promos. We are going to have additional marketing expense, things of that nature, or I'm going to incur expediting expense. I may have a temporary location. This is a very common one. Excuse me. Temporary locations, you incur the extra expense. You have, okay, if this facility is no longer usable, I'm going to pivot to this other facility and it's already outfitted. Maybe you can't have it already outfitted and up and running, but you have a space identified that you're going to be able to transition to quickly, get operation running. Again, you're not going to be able to eliminate the damages necessarily, but mitigate the damages. And that is a duty that any individual that has had a loss has to, in due diligence and dispatch, try to mitigate their damages if it at all is a reasonable possibility to do. So that's a little bit about loss mitigation for any loss situation.
Yep. So what is an extra expense that you've seen quite a bit, or common themes when it comes to extra expenses?
I think I want to start with what I generally see people think is an extra expense, but isn't. And then I'll go into the extra expenses. So in not every business interruption event, one of the biggest issues is salaried personnel. You have an event, you now have your management team or a salary team working around the clock. Their quality of life has diminished. They're now working 80 hours a week instead of 40 hours a week. Well, I want the 40 hours a week quantified and recovered. Well, extra has to be extra. A salaried personnel, by definition, you're paying them a fixed amount. So if they work 40 hours or they work 80 hours, are they getting paid the same? If they're getting paid the same, well, then there is no incremental extra expense. It has to, going back to what would have happened had the event not occurred, what would the expense for that person have been? Would it have been the same? Would it have been more? Would it have been less? If it would have been less, now you have an extra expense. One thing you can do is, well, I have a salaried personnel, but I paid them a retention payment, or I paid them a reasonable extra amount because they were working around the clock and I can't afford to lose them. This actually ties back into loss mitigation. I have to mitigate my exposure. If I lose this key personnel, it's going to cost me way more. So I need to pay them a little extra. Then that would be an extra expense. Extra rent. Do you have now a temporary location you're renting? That's, again, it's extra. Do you have overtime? Are your employees working extra hours? To the extent it's incrementally higher than it would have been, that is extra. Again, I mentioned the third-party purchasing on the previous question. Are you incurring extra cost to maintain your relationships that you otherwise would not have incurred?
So how do you assess the values of the different seed to sales streams? Jim, do you have any thoughts pertaining to these different streams in the marijuana industry?
I do have thoughts. In general, valuation of cannabis businesses and any business really comes down to the economic benefits the owner is going to be able to realize from his ownership or his ownership interest in the business, right? So a lot of this is dependent on stage of development. Where does the business stand? Are they pre-revenue? Are they early stage or mature? Have they been operating for a while? And then secondly, what's the legal structure? Are these standalone businesses, a growing, harvesting, cultivation business and a dispensary, or are they vertically integrated? Well, my thoughts on this are going to be, let's talk about them as if they're standalone businesses versus vertically integrated. The way typically a valuation analyst looks at it is we want to first understand what the history of the operations has been, right? How long ago did it start? When did they achieve profitability? Since the time they've achieved profitability, how stable have the earnings and cash flows been? That's going to be a constant theme across all of the business lines. We're going to want to either capitalize or calculate a present value of projected income streams, and that is going to be the discount rate or the rate of return that we use that an investor would require will be based on the perceived risk of the various types of businesses. So, we want to assess the risk of each of these different types of categories. With growing or harvesting, we have risk in that it's very capital intensive. We need to have capacity. We need to be able to assess the yields that the businesses being able to obtain from their canopy, and of course, pricing trends, wholesale pricing trends in their markets. So those are the biggest risks that we consider when we're assessing the cash flow streams for cultivation businesses. For extraction, they're in between. They're part of the supply chain between the cultivator and the dispensary. So you have to look at that. Who is their customer base? What is the demand? What is pricing like in their market? What extraction process are they using? What type of equipment are they using? What will their capital needs be going forward? And processors, manufacturers are not too dissimilar as to extraction, in that they're also part of the supply chain, but they rely on the supply chain as well. So they have to establish relationships and contracts with suppliers. They also need to establish relationships and with the dispensaries that they're selling to. Equipment is a concern. It's not quite as capital intensive as the cultivation business, but it's still an issue as to how automated or manual their processes are. The demand for their products and how they're selling and pricing, once again, is a top consideration. And then lastly, dispensary. Well, number one item is location, location, location. As we know, we have in the cannabis businesses, the individual state that the business is located in is going to be very important. And not only the state in terms of their licensing and regulation, but the location within the state. It's going to be advantageous to have a location that maybe is on the border of another state in which cannabis is not legal, or they only have medical cannabis, but not recreational. So location is a very important consideration. Competition, you're going to want to assess the demographics of the market that they're operating in, and what is the issue with licensing in terms of potential future competition? Who's coming in? When are they coming in? And what is that going to do to the pricing of their product? So all of that goes in consideration in our DCF model. Typically, we're seeing rates of return required somewhere anywhere from 15% to the mid 20%. Early stage companies would be even higher than that. And that is how we develop, at least an initial indication of value. And obviously, where we can find comparable companies that have sold, we would also look at companies that are in the same line of business, or at least that have majority of their revenues that are being derived from the same line of business.
And I would jump in to say that, one thing I've seen is there's kind of a difference between the first three A's on your screen and the dispensaries in terms of if a buyer is looking at a grower, an extractor, a producer, those business operations can vary wildly between the different operating businesses, and their level of profitability can also vary wildly versus for a dispensary, the operations are fairly known. If you just look at revenue and sales, you can get a pretty good idea of what the footprint of that location will generate in sales, unless, as Jim pointed out, we think there's a change in regulation or a competitor moving on. But buyers of dispensaries, if they look at sales, they'll know how many people they want to purchase, how much inventory as a percent of revenue they want to purchase. It's much easier to predict what the cash flows of a dispensary will be, as opposed to a grower, extractor, producer. It's much more variable in terms of how people are growing, how efficiently or not efficiently they are. So revenue can be, in my practice, a reliable metric for dispensaries, but would not be for growers or extractors, as you have no idea what if any, profitability is coming from those more capital intensive businesses.
Absolutely. Sorry. So how have valuations changed over time? Obviously, the first regulated system started in 2012, and things have genuinely changed over the last 12 years. Eli, what are your thoughts about the changes that we've seen over the last 12 years?
Yeah, the market has changed a lot over time, like quite a bit. So much so that sometimes it's challenging to use, or you have to use with caution, historical transactions, just because of where the market was at any particular time. There was a lot of excitement in the early years of legalization. I'm in the Pacific Northwest, so I was somewhat involved in Colorado, but really got involved in cannabis in Washington and Oregon. And when legalization came online, there's a lot of public funds raised through Canadian companies, and they had raised money, and simply they needed to deploy capital or give it back to their investors, but that's no fun. So they really needed to deploy capital into Oregon and Washington, and as a result, into some of the early stage companies in 2018, 19, and 2020, the multiples and what we were seeing from a business valuation perspective were very high, but largely because of excitement of a new industry and capital raised that needed to be deployed. And now, especially in those markets, they gave out so many licenses, there's just really heavy competition now. And so the initial surge of funding and interest has waned, and now the reality has gone from much more invest into the green rush to more traditional business valuation techniques that Jim outlined so well, which is what's going to be the return to the investors? We're back to the kind of cash flow interest. Whereas if you look at some of those earlier multiples, it was not based on the cash flow. It was based on all of those other exciting qualitative factors for investing.
Yeah, and COVID honestly helped my clients quite a bit. When people are given free money and they're staying home, sales were fantastic, but things have obviously normalized in the same situation. A lot of licenses for states that don't have limits, which I think is important.
And I was just going to mention that, there's a couple of ways to look at value, right? And the way people think about value, sort of, if you look at the industry on a national basis, we have multi-state operators who are publicly traded. And of course, we saw their value, as Gene alluded to, peaked in February of 2021, right? We just had this big rush of demand from COVID. It was fueling a lot of optimism and a lot of funds, and publicly traded operators, stock prices were at their peak. They had stock available to do deals. They had excess capital, as Eli mentioned, and they were deploying that money at a rapid rate. Since February of 2020, 2021, it's been pretty much a downward trend. And prices really, I would say, bottomed out in the summer of 2023. Since that time, there have been blips, and those blips usually come from some announcement of a regulatory change or a hint of a possible regulatory change. So when HHS talked about rescheduling, right? We saw a bump in the stock prices. Then DEA kind of confirmed, yes, we are, thinking about this recommendation, another bump in the stock prices. Then in August of this year, DEA says, well, we're thinking about it, but it's going to take us a while. It's not going to happen until after the elections. We're going to have hearings in December. All of the gain that the stock prices saw was lost, and we saw a dip in the stock prices. So those companies, there's a lot of information and a lot of emotion that's playing with the prices. The smaller companies, right, are more, I would say, geared to what's happening in their local markets, right? And we can see as cannabis is introduced into a new market, there's kind of a trend, right? There's an initial 12, 18, maybe even 24 months where demand is outstripping supply. So prices are good, people are making money. Then there's sort of a plateau because additional competitors are entering the market. Pricing starts to become compressed. And then those prices start to decline and you see this downward trend. And then at that point, it becomes a matter of, who's an efficient and a low-cost operator. The low-cost operators are going to be the companies that sell at the highest values. So I just wanted to point that out that, a lot of people pay attention to the national sort of pricing, but really for smaller companies, a lot of it is really affected by local markets, local regulations. What is the likelihood that medical markets are going to approve recreational cannabis? Those kinds of factors that are really causing them to move the needle in the valuation set.
And not only just the low cost operators, but the operators that are able to produce enough volume to realize enough profits. I mean, some of the companies I've worked on, they just don't have a large enough canopy size because of the building that they're in to be able to turn out enough product to compete at those margins to make enough money. I mean, they need to go back and raise more funds or increase canopy size, but that's very challenging to do. And so some of it is just the sheer size and volume to be a major player and realize enough profits from the settled market dynamics. Totally agree.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I think I saw an article that came out from one of the industry researchers and they do this annually. They indicated that only 27% of cannabis companies are actually making a profit. I think about 40% maybe, or a third, or 35 to 40% are about breaking even, and the rest are still losing money. So that's an improvement over where it was a year ago, but just a slight improvement, and it's incrementally getting better. And I think the outlook for 25 is still more improvement. And I think that's what's driving a lot hope and expectation in the industry.
Hopefully.
And speaking of valuations, how do the markets across the United States compare? Obviously, there's different systems in place and licensing schemes and just different ways that different states are handling the licensing or not handling it. No moratoriums. What do you see and what do you think about these different markets? Starting from the West, obviously, which is vastly different than the Midwest and the upper Northeast.
Yeah. Well, I'll start and then you guys can add to it. But yeah, I mean, I'm in Oregon and Washington where they really pumped out a ton of licenses and gave it to the market to compete, which was great from an equity perspective in terms of everyone that dreamed of owning a cannabis company could. But the dynamics of the market here is that it's really it followed exactly the trend that Jim outlined. But now we're kind of sitting in a lot of supply, same demand dynamics. So prices were compressed and now it's kind of a bloodbath of competition and the small operators are really getting dinged. So where it was everyone that wants a license gets a license and compete, it's kind of a game of attrition in terms of do you have enough capital to outlast outplay the competition versus in the Midwest, we've worked on some projects where for the whole state, they gave out 10 licenses and the revenues as a result, I mean, those are golden tickets and they have tens of millions of dollars of sales for each dispensary because there's just very few dispensaries and there's pros and cons of each. But obviously, having one of 10 dispensary license in a whole state is super valuable. And, you're great to get that. And now you have a lot of revenue coming to you. One in thousands of dispensary licenses for a state is less valuable. So you cannot compare dispensary to dispensary across states. Every market is very different.
Agree. And then, aside from the licensing, which is really important because a lot of back when the MSOs were acquiring businesses, they were looking primarily in limited license states. But you also have to consider, state and local regulations, taxation issues in the individual state, whether it's income tax, sales tax, excise tax, any other local municipality tax that might be levied. So one of and I would say a third large issue is the state of the illicit market, right? So just because cannabis became legal in these markets doesn't mean that the operators that were selling cannabis prior to that just went away, right? They're still operating and they are able, in most cases, to price their product much lower than the legal operators because the legal operators have to worry about 280E, they have to worry about all the regulations, they have all these taxes they have to pay. It makes it very tough for them to compete. Obviously, they have a lot of things on their side in terms of quality and convenience and things like that will attract consumers. But consumers will only go so far in terms of a premium they will want to pay. In markets, in California, in DC, markets like that, the illicit market is still very active and still very much of an issue. So the government's willingness and effectiveness of cracking down on illicit operators is a big factor.
Yeah.
Agree.
Having good regulatory systems makes it a little bit easier. We don't have, near those issues in Colorado, but their regulatory system is very, very severe and very hefty. I think we're up to like 600 pages of rules at this point. Maybe it's a little much, but we have lots of those issues, supposedly. Let's talk about banking. Banking is such a fun area. Everybody loves talking about cannabis banking and some of the limitations. So what is the status currently with availability for banks and credit unions from your perspective? And Eli or Jim, even Luke, who would ever like to start first. Go ahead.
Well,
I'll just jump in with the little bit that I know. I think I've seen statistics published that only about 10% of U.S. banks and maybe 5% of credit unions are involved in interacting in the cannabis industry. So that just goes to, that just tells us that the availability is very limited, where companies and these banks and credit unions are being very selective, right? They're going to be doing business with the cream of the crop of the cannabis businesses, ones that have positive cash flow, ones that have good systems in place, ones that may have real estate or other collateral they can latch onto. So it's very limited at this point. There are also non-regulated lenders, private lenders that are involved in the industry. And one of the issues that's been hanging out there for a long time is the legislation has been introduced, it seems like annually, to try and pass the safe banking regulation or safer banking act that would make it, provide the safe harbors for bank institutions and credit unions to participate and have those regulations be less onerous. But it's still only limited to financial institutions, so it's not really affecting investment bankers. It's not affecting private lenders. It's not affecting the ability of companies to list their stock on U.S. stock exchanges. So it would be helpful, but it never, there was some hope because in September of 2023, the Safer Banking Act did pass through the Senate Banking Committee with some bipartisan support. So there was hope looking at 2024 that maybe something would get done with that. But as with many of the previous versions of the legislation, it's kind of sitting there and not really, and nothing is going to happen until after the election for sure.
Yeah. And I remember we were hopeful before the last election that something would happen after that
Yes, if the
election.
Democrats get in, it'll be much
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. And so, I mean, ever since, and that's, I think, something that ties back to the valuation too, is that it's just very challenging / impossible to predict when any of this legislation will change, if it ever does. I mean, I remember from 2018, we were talking about, oh, well, this is a no-brainer. Public sentiment is so in favor of that. So it makes sense that soon it will be fully federally legal and soon banks will want to participate. But yeah, as Jim said, right now, I think it is predominantly, in my experience, limited to the credit unions. The one state operating credit unions seem like they are on the forefront of wanting to provide this service, but in doing so, the reporting requirements and ability to work with those credit unions, the bar is very high because they will only work with you if they feel like the cannabis company won't tarnish their reputation. They have regulators too. And so they're going to be very choosy about who they decide to work with. And it's just another challenge for the cannabis businesses to meet that expectation and bar.
And just, on a personal note, I've been a cannabis attorney for 12 years and my bank accounts actually got shut down and I'm not growing plants. But banks are very, very cognizant of what people are doing. And, there's those SARS reports they have to file. And so, the local banks are who are willing to kind of put their neck out there for marijuana businesses, but it's not the big banks. Chase is not a big fan of of cash smelling like marijuana. So kind
Yeah,
of
but yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Gene, is that beyond just their regulatory requirement, it's not fun for banks are not actually used to handling that much cash. I mean, they need new processes to be able to handle tens of thousands of dollars of cash or hundreds of thousands of dollars of cash. I mean, you do not generate that. Most other industries do not generate that level of cash, and so it's like increased cost for the banks to have to deal with it, and so that's even more friction of how heavily do they want to get in invested into a cash processing business as opposed to a banking
right.
business.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the upside, I think I've seen statistics that say if the industry was open and the regulations loosened, there's something like $1 to $2.5 billion of potential interest income that would be generated from the cannabis industry for banks. So there's always a carrot there. It's just a matter of cost benefit and risk versus benefit. So.
And
Right.
if they opened it all the way up further, then there would be less cash to worry about because then people could go through with, perhaps using credit cards and debit cards like every other industry.
Yeah, and we'll talk about, that portion of the industry in a couple slides, but that's one of the big problems too, is that the dispensaries have to hire secured trucks to come pick up this cash. So it's another expense for the dispensaries. And then they have to worry about security and some of the issues with a lot of break-ins happen with dispensaries because people believe there's a ton of cash just sitting around. I don't know, everything's obviously locked in a safe, but there's a lot of local jurisdictions that require the facilities be built like vaults. because people will run their cars through at some of these dispensaries, pull out the ATMs. I mean, some of the craziest kind of movie type of burglaries that go on in cannabis because of the belief that cash is apparently just sitting around when in fact it's not. What kind of access do the minority owners of these businesses have when it comes to banking? Is there a difference between the majority owners of these businesses? Eli, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, a lot of my experience in this industry has been in litigation and ownership disputes, and it does perhaps not minority majority so much as an operating owner versus a passive owner is maybe even more the distinction because of the lack of banking and the high level of cash. If you're not an on-site operator owner, sometimes it's hard to get insight into what the business is really doing. Many businesses, you'll have a bank account to look in and track all the funds, track the automatic deposits in and withdrawals out for deposits in from a payment processor, withdrawals out from a payroll processor. And you can kind of look at a bank account to get good insight into what your business is doing. If you're a minority owner or a non-operating owner of a cannabis business that does not have banking or only uses banking in weekly chunks to deposit, it actually can be very tricky to get insight into what your business is doing. And so some of our projects have been just trying to give a minority owner a clear picture of how much money their business is making. If we look at the point of sale system reports, we can get a sense of what sales are. If we look at their payroll timesheets, we can get a sense of what their labor is. And if we look at their inventory purchases and metric, we can get a sense of what cost of goods sold are. So as opposed to for a different type of business with more regular access to banking, those things could be determined from a bank account. In my cannabis business projects, we've really had to tie together third-party sources to try to recreate an income statement and then compare that to the safe or the bulk deposits into a bank account to determine, is as much money as should be flowing, has it been flowing or not? Are we missing money? It's very challenging for a minority owner to have insight without that type of separate analysis.
And from the passive minority owner, what they're mainly interested in are the distributions that they're going to receive, right, from their investment. So it's challenging in an environment where you don't have options like lines of credit, right, that you can use to sort of balance out the ebbs and flows of the business or the seasonal nature, et cetera. And it oftentimes is one of the things that leads to frustration from these investors, in that they can't understand why they're not getting, more frequent or larger distributions. And it's, as Eli mentioned, they just don't have visibility and access to see what the active business owners have to deal with in order to make sure they have, a sufficient amount of cushion to run their normal operations.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jim. I mean, the harvest cadence alone for a grower really can determine the cash flow cycle as well, and so capital extensive, 100%.
So I think we've, discussed a lot of the challenges that marijuana entities have in obtaining banking and access to banking. Funding, in my experience, has also been problematic. There is some marijuana banks that are allowing and doing some loans, but they want a lot of collateral, and that collateral tends not to be the licenses, and they obviously don't want to collateralize the inventory because that would be a very problematic way of collateralization. But for funding, a lot of the stuff that I see as far as right now currently is still private equity funding with interest rates around 15%, short-term collateralization, and even pledging of membership interest in some of these entities. But also understanding too that these lenders don't necessarily want to own marijuana businesses. They merely want to get paid back huge amounts of profits in their mind. So I think that's what I've been recently seeing. It's kind of always been that way. Private money, borrowing from friends and family, those types of situations. Jim and Eli, what any differences from what you've been seeing?
No, I think, going through the different stage of development, it starts out with friends and family. As they develop and start producing revenues, and that maybe their capital needs um, uh, become greater, then they need to extend their capital raising out to through a more formalized process where they engage, if not an investment banker, at least some type of financial advisor that assists them with a, formal presentation to investors, which means they have to start preparing, either if they're not getting audited financial statements, they need to start getting, uh, you know, financial statements that have been scrutinized by outside accountants. They need to start having a business plan, doing projections, things that like normal investors want to see, right? Um, and some will also turn to techniques like if they have real estate or own real estate to do a sale and leaseback to generate funds from the real estate to provide funding for the operating business. So there are a few different options that they can go through, but it definitely involves getting more sophisticated and formalized in the financial reporting and tracking process.
Yeah, I think one of the offshoots or results of the either high cost of financing or uncertainty is that I've seen, if let's say you have four owners, there's a difference between them in terms of their risk tolerance. And so one project we recently worked on, one of the owners was very passionate about, we're doing great, we're dominating the market, we should grow and take advantage, and growing is the way. But in order to grow, sign up for Gene's 15% interest rate, a personal guarantee may be required, which is very scary, and it's a big bet with an uncertain regulatory requirement. And then one of the other owners was on the other page of saying, we're making good money, why would we go out and over leverage ourselves and take on that risk? The two in the middle, we're just watching the show in a sense, in terms of the debate. And so that caused a full-blown ownership dispute in terms of there was just a um, lack of clear 100% vision between the four owners as far as what the next step should be. And if it wasn't so challenging to get funding, I think they would have just likely proceeded down the regular growth. And so, if anything, I think the cannabis industry has made me realize that we take so many things for granted in terms of the normal business environment of you can just go get a loan, pledge the business, grow the business. The access to capital is makes it so smooth for businesses, and cannabis businesses just at this point don't have that luxury. And there's a lot of fallout for that, from that.
Another downside is that often if they're planning expansion or have some capital, that they will just do a internal capital call, right? And of course, the business owners have different, as you said, different levels of risk and also just different ability to come up with additional capital to contribute, which, when some are contributing, others aren't contributing, ends up normally with the owners not contributing, getting their equity investments diluted. So they're getting a smaller and smaller interest. That gets them upset. So it's just another thing that makes operating a cannabis business a very, tricky and a kind of a balancing act.
And not true in all cases, but based on my experience, more often than not, the people the owners that get their shares diluted without the capital are the ones doing a primary amount of the labor and
Yep.
duties. And so they're working very hard to operate it, and there's a capital call, and maybe more of the silent capital heavy owner, puts up more money. That's a dynamic that I've seen cause owner disputes as well.
It breeds a lot of resentment when you have people trimming plants and then,
Yeah.
people that aren't, and yeah, it causes lots of
Getting their
litigation.
ownership diluted. Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously rescheduling is still not done. The hearings start in December. What do you see as the benefits, and will that actually pertain to banking / funding, et cetera, if in fact rescheduling does take place? Eli?
Well, I'll start and then I'll be curious to hear your perspective, Gene, as well, since you're a great attorney in this space. But I mean, from my perspective, rescheduling, it would get rid of 280E. It would perhaps make the banks feel more comfortable kind of removing a lot of these road bumps or speed bumps from this industry. And so it could help down the road, but the gears of rescheduling are so slow that I'm not sure when it will happen. But curious your thoughts, Gene.
I think that because it's not going to be federally legal still, even with rescheduling, I don't anticipate that the big banks are going to want to get involved still, because there's still going to be a question. If it's Schedule 3, what does that look like? It's not federally legal. Are you supposed to have the DEA prescription type of licensing in order to sell? That doesn't even touch the recreational market, because that's not going to be going anywhere. I mean, the bottom line is marijuana is not going anywhere. And I think a lot of people think that rescheduling is like the first step to descheduling, and it's, potentially great for research, et cetera. But the bottom line is, like, it really should be treated like alcohol and descheduled for the banks to really want to get involved, because it's still a gray area and there's just a lot of questions. And even after the hearings in December, there's going to be litigation, there's just a lot of stuff that is going to happen. And I just don't think the banks have the appetite to be involved in that, to be honest. That's kind of my
Maybe I think a lot of the players that are in now will still be the players that are in after rescheduling. Maybe it will be easier because cannabis businesses should be more profitable after rescheduling, which will, provide more cash flow for repayments of loans, maybe make it more palatable to banks. The risk is lower. Maybe the rates will come down. So you could see some tangential benefits of it just because it would make cannabis businesses be able to operate more profitably and have more free cash flow, which makes banks feel better about, lending money to those businesses.
Yeah.
But probably still the same players.
And looping back around, because I think we've all talked about it in the background, but rescheduling would remove 280E, which would allow for cannabis companies to deduct all their expenses. Right now they're limited, so it would allow a deduction of all expenses, resulting in lower income taxes being paid and more cash flow available, as Jim was saying.
Absolutely. So payment processors, I don't know. So, obviously a lot of dispensaries are cash businesses, but that has slowly been changing over the last couple of years, and payment processors have started getting involved. The problem is MasterCard and Visa are against using credit cards. Point of sale systems are not supposed to be using anything related to payment processing, because everything goes through Visa and MasterCard, like clearing houses. And so they routinely would send letters to dispensaries or marijuana businesses and, kind of saying, stop doing this. For my clients, a lot of companies, payment processors will kind of show up, have some new program that they're selling them. I've actually seen instances where payment processors try telling clients that they've been certified by a bank. There's no certification process for payment processing. So, that's constantly a problem. And a lot of the payment processing companies will be around for about 6 months. They'll lose their merchant bank accounts, because they find out they're marijuana entities and they're not being honest, which is actually a felony. You can't lie to your bank, like that's bad. And then that platform will disappear, and then you'll have a new one show up, and it's like this rotating, I call it whack-a-mole with the payment processors. So you see that quite a bit. And then now we've been seeing a lot of entities that are doing ACH transfers. So you'll go into a dispensary, but people don't really feel comfortable handing over their account numbers and their routing numbers to dispensaries. I don't think that platform really has a lot of legs. And it's problematic. And then, you know, at one point there was a gift card program. I don't know if you've ever seen the litigation. I think it was called Links. And there was a gift card program where you could go in, put a bunch of money on a gift card, and then use it in dispensaries. Well, this company was taking all this money in for gift cards, and then all of a sudden it disappeared. So there was a bunch of lawsuits pertaining to those types of strategies. I mean, people will find any way to potentially steal from each other, but also to make money that isn't going to work in the long term. That's what I've seen. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about some of the stuff that you've seen, but on a day-to-day basis, those are some of the issues that I think that marijuana entities have.
Yeah, I think it's true because people are trying to provide a solution, and there are solutions, they're just illegal. And so whether you have an ATM in your lobby or a payment processor, the routing and account number is a new one for me. So, you know, all of these challenges, I guess, you know, we focus so far on a lot of the challenges, but as a result of the challenges, the cannabis companies I've seen that are just dialed in and hitting home runs and navigating it well, they're super profitable and making good money and are going to survive the war of attrition because it's so hard. And so it makes it ripe if you've got a good management team that can navigate all of this. It makes it ripe to be kind of a winner on the other end. In some respects, it's a good opportunity for those types of companies.
Yeah, absolutely. We're running out of time, so we're just going to stop with the final slide pertaining to mechanisms utilized for startups. So we'll kind of end on this slide, and Jim, Eli, Luke, go ahead and kind of opine what you're seeing when it comes to the startups, maybe even starting in the Northeast, because those are the biggest markets that are kind of coming online versus the West, where we're kind of old school at this point. We're the old OGs.
I was gonna say, there's not too many startups that I'm seeing in Washington and Oregon anymore, which makes sense. Go to the new green pastures. So yeah.
Yeah.
I think the mechanisms are still the same as I described before for early stage companies, friends and family, followed by more round of financing from outside investors through a more formalized process. One of the issues that we're seeing in new states, is with the social equity programs. And in the social equity programs, the issue of, it's great that someone has access to a license, but how do they get the funding to get up and running and to compete with all of the other players? So, some individual states are providing grant programs or loan programs. Each one is doing it a little bit unique or different way. And I think trying to learn from what worked or didn't work with the preceding state that went this route, but they're still in the very early stages. I know in Illinois, where I'm located, social equity programs that were supposed to roll out 2 years ago are really just starting to be trickling out now because there's been a lot of challenges, and the capital funding part of it is still in its infancy. So,
yeah, awesome. Well, we're out of time. This was fantastic. I appreciate everybody just showing up and enjoying this business, and it was great. Any final comments from anybody? Nope. Good. Awesome. Well, it's Friday. Everybody should have a fantastic happy hour tonight after 5, and have a great